When talking about countries that have had huge impacts on world history, very few can claim an effect close to Mongolia's. I think it goes without saying that the Mongol Empire was huge and globally impactful, though that can't really be said about today's Mongolia. Still, Mongolia has some fascinating modern history. Mongolia today is a fairly large, sparse country sandwiched right between Russia and China. This land has long been a place of conflict between the Russian and Chinese empires, with both countries greatly influencing the development of the modern state. First, it's important to understand how Russia and China shaped the political geography of the country. The land you'll see labeled as Mongolia on a world map isn't quite telling the whole story. Mongolia is actually split into two parts, Outer and Inner Mongolia. As part of the Qing dynasty's divide and conquer strategy that won them control of all of China, Inner Mongolia was administered as part of the Chinese core, while Outer Mongolia, what is today the modern state of Mongolia, was treated as a military buffer zone. Over time, however, Han settlers began encroaching on formerly ethnic Mongol lands, bringing with them new economic policies that exploited the seasonal nature of the traditional Mongolian economy. Many local Mongolians were now heavily in debt to the Chinese merchant class and were losing their homelands. Military outposts established throughout Mongolia, supposedly for national defense, quickly turned into Han Chinese settlements, displacing even more native Mongols. With all of this, it shouldn't come as a surprise that many Mongolians welcomed the Russian Empire's interventions in the region starting in the early 20th century. Russia promised to respect Mongol culture and identity, in theory at least, something the Qing were actively trying to stamp out. Mongolian independence movements seized upon the weakening and eventual collapse of the Qing in 1911, creating the modern Mongolia we have on the map today. Originally, it was a theocratic state, a khanate under a guy named Bogd Khan. If you think Nepal has a weird flag, get ready for the letter E. This new government sent a request to Russia for potential military assistance in the event of Chinese attempts to retake Mongolia. Russia interpreted this as a request to become a Russian protectorate, an opportunity that was eagerly seized. Bogd Khan is generally described as naive when it came to dealing with Russia, doing things like taking trade deals that were extremely disadvantageous for Mongolia while simultaneously praising the supposed fair deal. This was all part of a broader Russian scheme to establish control over northern China, but this plan would be cut short by World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. Mongolia found itself caught up in the Russian Civil War in 1921 when the Red Army invaded to finish off the last anti-Bolshevik forces. A new pro-Soviet government was installed and recognized by the Soviet Union in November 1921, creating the Mongolian People's Republic, the first communist country outside of the USSR, under the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, or MPRP. The Soviet Union in theory ripped up all the Tsarist-era unequal treaties with China, but used the loophole of simply not negotiating a new treaty to maintain their control of Mongolia. Despite many in the new Mongolian government calling for a sort of greater Mongolian state to be established by reclaiming Inner Mongolia, the Soviets ultimately ceded that territory to the nationalist government in China. Mongolia would again be essentially a military buffer zone, but for the Soviets this time. Imperial Japan had been expanding into northern China as well, something the Soviet Union was keen to check by maintaining a presence in Mongolia. Mongolia was also planned to be a good starting point for supporting a communist revolution in China if one ever happened. With tensions between China and Japan throughout the 20s and 30s making the region potentially unstable, Mongolia kept close to the USSR for protection. China was actually the country Mongolia was more worried about, as secret negotiations between Japan and the Soviets in 1925 had resulted in an agreement where the two agreed to split the regions into spheres of influence that neither side would meddle in. Moscow being essentially in charge of Mongolia's security would turn into total economic dependence, with the Soviets setting up new hospitals, railroads, and banks in the country. The Soviet Union and Mongolia signed an agreement where they became each other's most favored nation in regards to trade, a privilege no other country besides Mongolia was ever granted with them. Definitely a double-edged sword, however, as it practically banned Mongolia from trading with anyone else. Mongolia and the Soviet Union would be very close throughout their relationship, with Mongolia sometimes even being nicknamed the 16th Soviet Republic. Part of Mongolia's socialist development was eliminating the feudal nobility and the feudal system that still existed in much of the country. Herders had their herds collectivized, and many were forced to settle in cities. This was a fairly unique process, pretty much being a country going directly from feudalism to socialism without an intervening capitalist period. The Soviet Union worked with Mongolia on internal security as well, much of which was excising Chinese influence from the country. Chinese merchants in the private sector were pretty much all deported, as well as many Chinese people that were deemed counter-revolutionary. Mongolia's state internal guard even maintained its own intelligence network in China in the 30s. Following Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Mongolia would take steps to greatly strengthen its military. Military service was made compulsory and a mutual defense treaty was inked with the Soviet Union. Many in the Mongolian government were unhappy with this agreement, as it positioned Mongolia as the first line of defense against Japan and gave the Soviet Union permission to station troops along the border with the new puppet state of Manchukuo. Since Japan's ambitions by this point were clearly focused on expanding to the west, this pretty much guaranteed that Mongolia would be the battlefield for any conflict between Japan and the USSR. Japan's reaction was also harsh, accusing the Soviet Union of militarizing the region. Japan supported a propaganda campaign within Mongolia spreading the idea of Mongolia needing a new state free from Soviet influence. Japan claimed they would be the guarantor of security of such a state, claiming some weird ancient racial commonality. Japan also claimed they were protecting China's interests, as China still didn't recognize Mongolia's independence. China's reaction was mixed. The government of China officially decried the agreement, saying the Soviets were breaking their previous deal with China. Unofficially, many in the Chinese government recognized the Soviet presence in the region as a key counterbalance to Japan's aggression, and for the most part they let it slide. Mao Zedong's communist movement also officially recognized Mongolia's independence around this time. The Prime Minister of Mongolia, Pelgedin Genden, openly denounced the treaty, calling it interference in the internal affairs of Mongolia by foreigners. Genden elaborated in private discussions with the Soviet ambassador, stating, "We lean on the Soviet Union not for its sake, and in the same way not for the international revolution, but in the interest of the constant strengthening of our national independence." Genden tried to reduce Mongolia's economic dependence on the Soviet Union by kicking out their specialists, advisors, and instructors. This plan largely failed due to many Soviets keeping various key positions and simply the shortage of trained Mongolians to replace them. Combined with Genden's reluctance to support a Soviet plan to annihilate approximately 100,000 Mongolian lamas, supposedly the class that supported Japan, Genden was deemed a Japanese collaborator by the USSR. He was invited to visit the USSR in 1936, where he stayed until he was executed in Moscow in 1937 on charges of being a Japanese spy. The new leadership of Mongolia under Khorlagin Choibalsan would be much more pro-Soviet. Choibalsan focused on creating a new education system that focused on socialist principles and invited Soviet advisors back to help restructure the government and party. Pretty much everything was redone, from the party's structure to the constitution of Mongolia. For officials that would stick around in Mongolia, there was one instructor for the Central Committee of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, 93 medical workers, an economic advisor for the government, and 2 history teachers. Throw in a partridge in a pear tree too and we're set. In 1939, Soviet and Mongolian forces would clash with Japanese forces at Kotkin Gol as part of the broader Soviet-Japanese border war throughout the 30s. While this battle is largely remembered for the Soviet Union's involvement, Mongolian troops also played key roles and suffered a much higher casualty rate compared to Soviet troops, proportional to the amount that were in the battle anyway. The border conflict would ultimately be settled by the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in 1941, as part of which the two agreed on mutual recognition of the Mongolian People's Republic and Manchukuo. China was greatly upset by this, as they are now in a full-fledged war with Japan, and complained to the United States about Manchukuo's recognition. In response, Soviet material military aid to China was cut almost entirely. Not really a big deal, considering they probably would have lost the aid anyway in 2 months when Germany invaded, but hey, certainly didn't help things. But this agreement would end just a few years later, when the Soviet Union and Mongolia invaded Manchuria in August 1945, at the very end of World War II. The important development here relating to Mongolia specifically was a deal that was formalized between nationalist China and the Soviet Union. China agreed to recognize Mongolia in exchange for the Soviet Union recognizing China's sovereignty over Manchuria and Xinjiang and a halt to support to Mao. It was actually the communists in China who would take an issue with the Soviet presence in Mongolia a few years later. In 1949, the new People's Republic of China, despite recognizing Mongolian independence, demanded the whole country be annexed into China. They believed the previous agreement the Soviet Union had with nationalist China entitled them to the land, and it was as integral to China as Manchuria, Xinjiang, or Tibet. The Soviet Union essentially pretended not to hear them and never really responded formally in regards to the issue. While the greater Sino-Soviet split that happened later was caused by more things than just Mongolia, of course, the situation certainly didn't help. Border clashes between China and the Soviet Union would flare up intermittently throughout the 60s. Also in the 60s, Mongolia began to normalize relations with an interesting country, Japan. Mongolia was a little wary of being entirely dependent on the Soviet Union, especially now that relations with China had broken down, and turned to the next major player in the region. Japan, for its part, still wanted to maintain influence in East Asia, even after the war, and saw Mongolia as a way to potentially get its foot in the door. Japan de facto recognized Mongolia in 1961 by supporting the country's entry into the United Nations. Japan would invest pretty large amounts of money into Mongolia, and became a reliable trading partner. Ties between Japan and Mongolia were, and are still strong today, being Mongolia's third partner, an alternative to the two giants the country finds itself in between. But let's back up a bit. While Mongolia did explore options for new partnerships, the government would remain very loyal to the Soviet Union. Choibalsan passed away in 1952, and Stalin, his benefactor in the Soviet Union, passed away in 1953. What happened in Mongolia after this is pretty similar to the Soviet Union, where there was a re-evaluation of various policies under these leaders. Stalin would be succeeded by Khrushchev, and Choibalsan by Yumjagin Tsedenbal. Tsedenbal had been an influential politician in Mongolia since the late 30s and commanded the Mongolian army during World War II. Tsedenbal generally resisted de-Stalinization efforts from the Soviet Union and maintained a very centralized grip on power. Part of this was suppressing various kinds of dissent, which was coming from many different sources. Tsedenbal very much wished to cozy up to the Soviet Union and arrested many intellectuals who weren't supportive of Soviet-style communism. One group that would be tougher to quiet were Mongolian nationalists. Many in Mongolia still revered Genghis Khan, and his 800th birthday was coming up in 1962. The communist government was very reluctant to celebrate the birth of a feudal warlord who was best known for conquering two countries that were now the world's foremost communist powers. Still, many Mongolians were expecting the occasion to be celebrated, and they had to give them something, especially considering China was planning celebrations in Inner Mongolia as part of the whole Mongolia is China thing, so Tsedenbal's hand was somewhat forced. Ultimately, it was decided that a celebration would be held on May 31st, 1962. A monument to Genghis was constructed near his birthplace, and some celebrations were held in Ulaanbaatar. The events and speeches focused more on Genghis's role in uniting Mongolia and on the people of Mongolia during Genghis's time, essentially trying to put a communist spin on celebrating a brutal imperialist. They were also careful to have it be organized by scientific institutions, framing it as studying history rather than actually celebrating the man. The Soviet Union was upset by the event, and the embassy complained to the Mongolian government. Mongolia hastily tried to cancel the run of Genghis-themed stamps they had printed, and many who gave speeches during the event were forced to give public self-criticisms. Tsedenbal also tried to have the monument to Genghis destroyed, but this was prevented by a local official who claimed it would disturb a nearby guest house. Throughout the 1960s, Mongolia rapidly and aggressively began to industrialize its economy and urbanize the population. Mongolia essentially had its own great leap forward, setting an ambitious and never-realized goal of catching up to East Germany economically. One major project was the construction of the city of Darkhan with help from fellow socialist states. The city was built near a coal mine, which became the backbone of the city's economy. Many factories were opened, such as a brick factory and a sawmill, and the city is still Mongolia's second largest city today. Through the mid-60s, spurred by Mongolia's entry into the UN, more Western nations began recognizing the country, most notably France and the United Kingdom. Ties with the USSR only strengthened, with Brezhnev visiting in 1966 to sign a stronger mutual defense treaty. With border clashes between the Soviets and China increasing, more Soviet soldiers also began to be stationed in Mongolia, approximately 2 or 3 divisions worth. Things were generally pretty alright through the 70s, though the stagnation of the Soviet economy during this period spilled into Mongolia as well. Mongolia was simultaneously attempting to urbanize, but also needed to support its sizable rural population. Part of the problem was the Soviet Union experiencing a shortage of meat at this time, particularly in the Far East, which they hoped Mongolia could provide. Mongolia consistently fell short of the Soviet quota, though this was in part due to blizzards throughout the 70s that killed large portions of the nation's livestock. This was criticized by the Soviet Union, as Mongolia hadn't adequately invested in their rural populations in recent years. In 1980, nearly all Chinese nationals were deported from Mongolia as relations with China only worsened when the two clashed diplomatically over the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Mongolia even accused China of sending diseased goats into Mongolia to hurt the country's herding industry. Mongolia's economy would stagnate and decline throughout the 80s, failing to hit most government economic and production goals. In 1983, there were some interesting diplomatic moves from Mongolia. The Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, together with the Syrian Ba'ath Party, issued a joint communique in support of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, though they carefully left out any specific endorsement of its leader, Yasser Arafat. Relations with China also improved slightly, with tourism between the two now being allowed, and a trade deal where Mongolia would provide minerals in exchange for trucks and oil. But, being so closely tied to the Soviet Union, Mongolia was caught up in the same political reshuffling and reorientation of the mid-80s USSR. While Tsedenbal was in the Soviet Union receiving medical treatment in 1984, he was abruptly dismissed from all his high-level positions by the rest of the party. The official claim was that they believed he was too unwell to continue his duties, and considering he would die a few years later, that was probably right, but there were likely other reasons. Tsedenbal had been blamed by Moscow for much of Mongolia's economic problems, with issues continuing despite huge amounts of Soviet cash flowing into the country. Tsedenbal also really hated China and was continuously issuing denouncements and causing diplomatic issues even when the Soviet Union was trying to soften policy on China. He also had a habit of sabotaging or simply kicking out younger members of the party, which certainly earned him enemies over the years. He was succeeded as leader by Jambin Batmonk, a former university professor. He became an eager supporter of Gorbachev and his policy of perestroika, advocating for greater autonomy in economic matters at the level of local governments. The political sphere was opened up slightly, with Mongolian newspapers being allowed to print articles and letters from readers critical of the government. Still, these reforms were pretty minor in the grand scheme, and the anti-communist movements that were springing up in Eastern Europe would inspire a similar movement in Mongolia. These were quiet, mostly underground groups organizing at first, though they began holding public protests against the MPRP in 1989. The Mongolian Democratic Union began holding large rallies in Ulaanbaatar in December 1989 with demands for greater freedom and openness as well as multi-party elections. Mongolian nationalism became a big theme for the protesters, with many singing traditional Mongolian songs honoring Genghis Khan. Protesters in traditional Mongolian clothing that had been outlawed by the communist government held a hunger strike in March of 1990, with Buddhist monks coming to show their support. The entire Politburo would resign also in March, being replaced by younger, reform-minded politicians. An announcement would follow in May that multi-party elections would be held. The MPRP actually won the elections quite easily, getting about 60% of the popular vote, though this version of the party was significantly reformed and hardly resembled the previous Soviet-backed incarnation. The Communists would lose the 1993 presidential election and the 1996 parliamentary elections, however, limiting their influence. The United States has played a large role in the country's politics since, helping to draft many of the country's electoral laws and giving advice to the opposition parties. Mongolia, since the end of the People's Republic, has become a very free and open country with a vibrant political sphere. Mongolia has since seen fairly rapid GDP growth and modernization, though much of the country is still very rural, with about 40% of the population still leading nomadic lives. Mongolia's journey in the previous century from a Chinese borderland to a theocracy to a Soviet ally and finally a liberal democracy is pretty fascinating, especially in the wider context of Asia, where nothing else exactly like that has happened. While the country is still very rural and underdeveloped in many parts, Mongolia for the most part is on an upward trajectory. Though the days of the Mongol Empire are long gone, Mongolia has still managed to carve out a space for itself between the two giants surrounding it. Mongolia's future is very much in its own hands now, and it's certainly a country to keep an eye on.
Уучлаарай, таны залгасан дугаар ашиглалтанд байхгүй байна. Та дугаараа шалгаад дахин залгана уу?